means it's recording?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being here. We are presenting on integrations, managing complexity, and ambiguity. So by the end of this session, nothing should be complex or ambiguous anymore. That's the goal. This is an hour of your life.
Yeah.
Very well invested, right? We are just Constantine and Luke Works. I should be on the other side. I'm a senior engineering manager at Palantir, and Jess can introduce herself.
Sure. I'm a senior engineer and a technical architect at Palantir. I've been there for almost 2 years on the date, actually, like today.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Happy work anniversary.
Thank you. This is my first Drupalcamp. I've been to one Drupalcon, so I'm super excited. This is also my first time doing Drupal things in Fort. Super excited.
So Palantir, the quick plug is we are a full services digital consultancy. We do strategy, design, and development. The development we do is almost exclusively in the Drupal space. So we've got lots of folks.
It's a complexity one.
It is.
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And it was a simple answer for your question. That's the goal. We are also sometimes funny.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. I'm sure.
So in today's session, we're hoping to talk specifically about integrations. We think of these in terms of mostly third-party integrations, but also internal services that you might be integrating with. The word integration can mean a great deal, many things. We'll spend a bit of time up front kind of defining the terms and talking about what we mean. And really the idea behind the session is integrations are a timeline and budget driver in many projects. They tend to be somewhere where scope isn't necessarily defined all that well at the start. I see heads nodding. You feel my pain. So who is the session for? People like me who read and write RFPs and give people general senses of, oh, your project's going to cost this many dollars and this many moons. And
people like me who have to sort of not have to, work on the sort of implementation side of the work that is sort of scoped and budgeted. Okay, how do I do the nuts and bolts of this and what sort of thing?
so our hope here is to start fairly abstract with what drives complexity in an integration, and be able to take that from sort of the highest level understanding of we've got a piece of functionality we're trying to get to do we have enough definition for a technical team to pick it up and run with it? And how do we get to that process, hopefully without spending too much time and energy defining something that is probably going to change and be wrong anyway, and also is accurate. So that's fun. So let's start off just talking about what do we actually mean when we say an integration. Let's define our scope for this session. So when we talk about integrations, what we're really talking about is the movement of information from one system to Drupal, right? To your Drupal site, whether that be into the Drupal database or just to the Drupal front end for some type of rendering, and making sure that you have communication, whether it be one-way or two-way, to some service. That's why I say it could be an external third-party service or another internal service that you're responsible for. Just to very quickly illustrate what a couple of integrations might look like, here's a screenshot of a website that we built, and here I've highlighted 4 different points of integration on the homepage above the fold here. We've got this appointment button on here twice that links off to the same appointment request service. My chart access for like health chart information. That is probably the simplest form of an integration. It is an HTML link. It's an anchor. We won't talk a lot about those. Scope there is pretty narrow. And then find a primary care. This is a fairly robust search that aggregates data from multiple locations to create a single user experience around search.
And here's a state government website. It's a content website, so transactions happen elsewhere. So the integrations are mostly to bring those transactions a little bit closer to the user on the site. So here we're pulling in some external data about an actual location for licensing and vehicle registration. We're pulling in some location information from Google and then linking off to a third-party form solution for, in this case, providing feedback.
So all of these fit some level of technical complexity in the integration here. And in terms of like what drives that complexity.
Yeah, so there are 4 factors that we're going to sort of talk about today. One is, what is the type of integration? So what is the direction of that flow of data? There are a couple different options. The other is, what are the mechanics of that? So like, how is the data being transferred? The third is, how is that data shaped or structured? And then the fourth is, how is the data actually being used? So in terms of the first one, again, what type of integration is it? Is the direction coming one way? Is it coming 2 ways? Is Drupal reading? Is Drupal writing? So the example that we just talked about in that state website, this is where Drupal was just pulling in, it was just consuming data and then showing it on the front end. So this was one way. This was Drupal reading. Here's a very simple explanation or a very simple integration that you're probably familiar with. So using sort of a social share widget where Drupal just writes in some metadata or some actual data about the sort of context of the page that you're on so that it can be sent to that external party for sharing and things like that. And then this is a search integration, which search is often bidirectional. So there's often content on Drupal that exists and is sent to some index or some third-party service, and then that is, again, accessed on that search results page. So this is a bidirectional integration.
And we're offering these examples to give us a thread with which we can talk about. So the specific examples here aren't nearly as important as what they stand in place of. So ignore the colors and the logos. That's not the point here. The point is, what are we actually doing on these pages?
The second factor that we talked about was the mechanics behind it, so the transportation protocol. And this can be something very technical, but in this case, we'll sort of take a step back and make it more abstract. And so there are 2 different types that we'll focus on today. The first one is sort of HTTP or web-based. So the next slide shows an example of, you're probably familiar with the term API, where there's this layer in between the third party and the site that you're working with that allows and facilitates this communication, often over the web. You tend to get responses that look like this, that are very structured. And that's great. So when a system has that, provides that kind of information, that usually means it's meant for a connection. It's usually meant for providing that information for people, so that's good. But also inherently doesn't mean anything about the complexity, aside from the fact that it's meant to do it. And we'll talk more about why after that. The second is when maybe for reasons like you can't access that third-party service because it's hidden behind a firewall and requires VPN. Maybe you need the data more closely and not access over the web. So maybe it's a dump of a database or an XML file or something that you literally transfer and then provide some kind of script or write some kind of script that will go through that and then use the data at that point. So that's an example.
So these are things that drive the complexity. How are you accessing the data? Another key factor to understanding and scoping the complexity of a particular integration is how well organized is the data. In database architecture, we talk about this as normalization, right? How discretely can you describe any piece of information? And the more discretely, the more normalized that data is, the smaller the chunks are, the more flexibility you have in using that information. So in the example of that search application, here we're showing the response that we're getting back from the external Lucene. It's an Elasticsearch backend on this site. And what we have in this response is actually both highly normalized data as well as highly processed data being returned from the search index. So the search index here is actually returning each and every discrete field. But in addition to that, we also have this body summary, which you can see there's actual HTML in here. So we're actually using Drupal to render these little snippets, each one of these chunks, and we're storing the full rendered markup in the search index as well, so we can return the full markup for fast display. The reasons that we do this are for speed and for consistency. We wanted to make sure that no matter where these search results were appearing, whether it be on this main site or any subsidiary sites, that we were pulling across the same styling and the same templates from everything. So that's why we're storing both processed as well as the highly normalized and structured data sort of in the same place. That example really limits your flexibility in the display, which was the intent, right? That was by design. It's like you request a thing, you're getting the full markup for the thing back, and if you want to change it, that's going to be a lot of technical work for you. In this example, it's a similar circumstance where you've got a search and you've got results coming back that are then being displayed on the front end. All that is being returned, I'm sorry, I know it's really hard to read here, but the slides will be online. All that's being returned in this request are the individual fields themselves. The full display of that data to make it meaningful to a user is the responsibility of the implementer, right? What do you do with the title field? Do you make it a link? Is it clickable? Is it not clickable? Are you showing an image? The image is there. It's in the data set. It's up to you what you do with it and how you work with it. Understanding what you will get from the source that you're integrating with and how that data is going to be presented to you, how it's going to be returned to you, will help form your understanding of the complexity of the integration. If you're just getting HTML back, there's not a whole lot you're going to do with that, right? You're just spitting it out to the page, delivering concatenated strings of HTML to the browser. That's all we're doing. If you're getting raw data back, chances are you're going to need to write some type of processor or template system to use that information.
The structure of the data is also part of the reason why the mechanics alone are an indicator of like the level of complexity, right? If you're getting it the right way, but it needs to be transformed, then that's complex. So it really depends on looking at a combination of all those different factors.
So another indicator of complexity, an early indicator that you can kind of look at from a mile away and say, oh, I'm going to need to unpack this. It's how is the data actually being used in the system? What is the user experience around that information? Sometimes the user experience here is very, very simple, right? I want a box on my web page that shows a Twitter feed. Cool. In your markups, you draw a gray box, you write Twitter in there, and you drop a line of code in the template, and you're pretty much done. Very, very simple, right? There's not a lot of complexity there. Sometimes the usage of the data, and sorry to carry that forward, the expectation there is people are going to scroll through the tweets, maybe click on one, right? It's kind of like a nice to have. Nobody actually builds a business process and conversions around Twitter. Not many people, anyway. Maybe Donald Trump does. But how the user is going to be interacting with that data and how important that data is to the organization is incredibly important. When you're talking about a healthcare system, getting folks to doctors' profiles so that they can click through to make an appointment is usually the most important part of the healthcare system's website, right? Getting people to the point of making an appointment, statistically those usually come from doctor profiles. So your data source might be nice and neat and organized. We've had the privilege of working with folks like Columbia Medicine out of New York. They have a whole website that is columbiadoctors.com, and it's nothing but an API for all of their doctors' profiles. It's so organized and neat and tidy, and all the information's there. It's great. They're the only ones I've ever worked with like that, though. Most of the time, the way this works, yeah.
What was their impetus for creating that?
I don't know that I can speak with any authority on that, but my experience of it was they have a distributed web model to where each department and like organization within the Columbia healthcare system can create their own web presence, and they needed a way to centralize doctor profiles, especially because doctors could work in network, out of network. They can be have administering rights at different hospitals all within the same healthcare system. It gets really complicated really quickly.
That's a way to keep it simple, though.
As is the example here, right? Where you have, maybe your source of truth data as in terms of is this doctor a person or a figment of someone's imagination, is an HR system. And guess what? HR systems, really, really not awesome for powering marketing sites. Nobody loves that. But we all have to do it sometimes, right? So you may end up having multiple sources of information that have to come together to create a single unified user experience. And that implies complexity. You're pulling from multiple sources to create a single experience. You might, in doing this, depending on the politics of the organization that you're working with, you might actually be creating a new single source of truth for this information, depending on how tightly you couple your system to whatever the old source of truth was. Like if the old source of truth was the healthcare system, nobody liked using it, and you're creating a thing where you're aggregating better information that gives people more control, but you're predicating that on, I'm going to sync 4 times a day with the healthcare system or with the HR system, and there will never be any data leakage, and here's how we know that, and we've got tests for that. People might actually start using your data as the new source of truth. Congratulations, you just got yourself a bunch of technical debt. Another driver of complexity, and once you start getting to this level of detail, in the phase that I'm looking at this data, sort of like the RFP, early sales, pricing phase, only rarely do we actually get down to this level of detail, but looking at data transformations. So how close is the data that's in your source of truth, or the place where you're getting your data, how close does that map to the actual display and the use of it? Some transformations are simple. Do it in CSS, right? Capitalize these words. Don't capitalize these words. Sometimes it's less simple. Programmatically enforce a style guide requirement that all phone numbers have periods and no dashes. Okay, cool. So now you're doing a little processing, a little regex, a little storing, a little reading. It's a little bit more complicated. Sometimes it gets a whole lot more complicated. Sometimes it requires having entire dedicated servers to perform business logic on pieces of information, to transform it, to be useful. And there's no real correlation between how complex the user experience is and how complex the data is to how complex the integration is. Those things aren't necessarily coupled. It's really about the transformation. So when you're looking at something like a Google Map integration here, the actual getting of the map, which is a very complex thing on the page itself, is simple, right? That's a single API call, and the whole thing is delivered as one package. That's not hard. Getting that phone number to display exactly the same way 100% of the time across an entire system where humans are entering data, that requires transformation. That's a little bit harder.
So at some point you'll be asking yourself, should we develop this functionality in-house, or should we reach out to that third party for integration? And there are a couple of factors that you can think of that might help you make that decision. First one might be, where does that data actually live, or who owns that data? The second one would be, does the sort of functionality or the business logic that is the underlying functionality of this integration, is that something that brings me more value to sort of pull in or to develop myself? And then the third one is, does this project need to expose data, kind of speaking to the point that Luke was saying, are we not creating a new single source of truth that someone else needs to rely on? So these are good questions to ask. So in the case of where's data live, so often Google is pretty infamous for this, right? Where, for example, reviews for a location, you don't own that information anymore. So if you want to pull it in and surface it on your site, then you have to. And that might oftentimes force your hand to do the integration.
The other thing to consider here with data ownership is any kind of protected data that you might be using. So FERPA, HIPAA, PII, any kind of data that might have some type of regulation or authority over it that your system may or may not comply with. You need to be able to think about those things. And if you're talking about building a form on a government website or a healthcare website, is that data HIPAA compliant in where it's being stored? Am I intaking it just to push it off to a different server that's HIPAA compliant? That might increase or balloon the complexity of that integration.
And that would also be, I would say, the business value that the integration provides is that security and that privacy, where it's probably worth it to go with a third-party integration than to go through the process of creating that robustness yourself. Or things like shopping carts are another example where that tends to be the case.
The third point here is about that data exposure that we were talking about. Is if you are creating that single source of truth or augmenting it, what are the implications of that for beyond the scope of your project or the thing that you're looking at? Is this going to have impacts outside of that? Are other people going to be looking at this data and need it in a particular format? Are you suddenly signing yourself up to provide a JSON API or XML feeds? There's all kinds of awesome ways to do integrations. There was a presentation earlier about feeds that I heard was stellar. So anyway, sorry. So bringing that all back to this idea of regardless of sort of where you are in that continuum of early planning phases for an integration, maybe you're on the technical side, maybe you're sort of pre-technical side, maybe you're halfway into an integration and you got to pull it apart because it's not working right. How do you manage? What are the steps? How do you go about it? Really, it comes down to start with the end in mind. As much information as you can get about sort of that end state and being able to work backwards from there. Being honest as you can about the information that you have. How much information do you have? What information do you not have access to? What information is hard to get, whether it be because of the transportation mechanics of it, the structure of it, access controls we haven't even really talked about. Sometimes data sits behind firewalls and VPNs. And then drawing a flowchart. Really just lay it all out as simply as you can. So, yeah, that's the idea here, right? So starting with that end state, what are your users expected to do? That should be the thing that drives the complexity or your understanding of how deep to go into this. Some integrations put a button on your page, right? That's all it does. What that button does, maybe you care, maybe you don't. Maybe it's just an anchor tag, and all you need to do is figure out how to get that anchor tag to render. Maybe it's a complex, we're aggregating an HR system with doctors, with a calendaring system so that people can book appointments directly online instead of requesting appointments, because those are two completely different workflows, one of which usually involves somebody at the hospital calling you on the phone. That's not fun. So understanding what is the goal of this integration. And then once you have that understanding and the understanding of the data, you can start to document.
Yeah, so this is an example of a real-life data flow diagram for an internal project that we were working on. We had the fortunate experience of starting with an end product and actually iterating on sort of a rough draft of something that folks were using internally. And it sort of has many of the aspects that we've already talked about. So we've got various sources of data, and you can tell that this is probably a complex integration because there are multiple layers here, and then there are multiple sort of stages that happen over time. So we've got multiple sources. We research each of those sources, like what is the format of the data that's going to come, how much transformation will we have to do. TLDR a lot was the answer to that question. We documented them, and then we thought about the end result. What is the thing that we need? What does that structure need to look like so that we knew what kind of transformation we had to sort of develop. We've got different protocols and different sort of directions of where data is being written to. So in this case, Drupal is both getting data from sources, saving in multiple caching layers throughout time, and then providing data via sort of an internal API to our decoupled React front end. At some points, we're looking at the data, we're comparing it to what already exists. Do we have to transform it? Do we have to send it somewhere else? But doing all this, we did before we wrote any code, which really helped us to sort of think about the code that we did have to write. I think it sort of made that process faster, and it gave us sort of a narrative of the process, thinking about the experience that we wanted users to have.
So it's simple, right? It's not hard. So going through this process of really deconstructing your integration, starting with sort of the end state in mind, what is the functionality, documenting what is the data itself and the things implied in that, the transportation, the structures, and then the business logic, the transformations that may have to happen. Those three things acting together define the complexity of your integration. And you need to be able to isolate each one of those things as best you can and understand each one as best you can in order to be able to speak to the complexity. Are you looking at an integration that's going to take 15 minutes to put a line of code on a page? Are you looking at an integration that's going to take weeks to be able to fully implement? How will you know it's done? About 6 months after your project is launched and the integration isn't broken yet is the cheeky answer there. It's never done, right? Your data sources might change over time. The data that you're providing might change over time. The point is these are things that are meant to be iterated on and to be living parts of your code base, but getting from zero to stable functioning integration requires this decomposition process.
And there's work that can happen at each sort of, when you're thinking about each of those different factors that determine the complexity. Like I'm just researching, what does an actual response from this third-party service look like? Is it structured? And thinking about what does the end user need on the front end? Then you know, okay, well this is what we're getting, and that's not very easy to sort of render, so we're probably going to have some transformation. So you can start to put together pieces as you go along. Stubbing data, there's a lot that you can do. Actually, for the data flow diagram that you saw, we kind of worked like this. So the last thing that we did was the data transformation. Like we were pulling in data and we were making a sort of fake data structure that we knew we wanted so that we could start building the front end. And then we're like, let's figure out how to actually make it work, as we sort of go along and have more information, which worked for us.
So I know that this is the last session before lunch. We were asked to hold about 10 minutes for questions, which is about as much time as we have left. It's a small group, but we're happy to field any questions y'all might have. Otherwise, we can get to the front of the lunch line.
When working on a project, how often does it happen when the client doesn't even know the complexity? So when they want to create to have this project done, but only after digging into what actually exists in data sources and everything, only then you realize it's actually way more complex than what maybe the client originally thought. How do you deal with that difference?
Yeah, so the first question you asked, how often does it happen? A lot. It happens a lot. I don't typically work with clients that are able to intuitively understand the complexities associated with the integrations that they want. And when I do get to work with folks like that, they're usually very, very technical, and that presents a different set of challenges within a project, right? Yeah, I don't ever expect somebody coming in to be able to decompose the complexity around an integration at the beginning of a project. What I want folks to be able to talk about is, what do you want to do? What do you want your users to be able to do? And then as a technical person on a project, it's my responsibility to ask the questions, do you have the data for that? Where's that coming from? Who can I talk to get sample files, sample data structures, to begin to unpack that and to be respectful of your potential client or the project's timeline and budget to understand we're starting to get into the realm of like no can do, like this doesn't, the benefit doesn't outweigh the costs here, and be able to speak to partial solutions like, well, we can get you this far for 80% of the effort. Is that worth it? What would it take to get that last little bit? So it's really about having that conversation within the scope of the project to know, because it is complicated and it's not often that there are easy answers. Even when you're integrating with well-known systems that have very well documented APIs and data structures, it still takes a lot of time to dig in and be able to fully understand, okay, this may be the data that I'm getting. Do we fully understand the data model that we're trying to output and to define that business logic in between? Usually that doesn't happen until you're partway through a project, at which point you're relying on trust and good faith of all the players that you'll get to a good solution. Does that map with your experience?
Yeah, and I was just saying those questions that you said, ask them as early as you can, because sometimes, especially if the answer lies within like an external dependency, then that's time that, right, every communication, there's time that has to happen back and forth. So like starting that process as early as you can, I think is important.
And I think most people probably have, a war story or two, if I can borrow the phrase. We launched a project last year that we started the project and we knew full well, this is our data source. This is where the data is coming from. But our contract is going to run out 3 months after our project launches, and we have no intention of renewing it. So can you make this integration robust enough that we can just swap out the data source later? And it's like, can you tell me what you're going to swap it out to? No, it's stuck in procurement land. We'll find out 3 months before this actually happens. Oh, so you're going to find out right about the time we launch, right? Yeah, Can you do that? Well, yes, but here's the costs associated with that. Here's the impacts. Here's the assumptions about what that new data source provider is going to look like. And that was having that conversation, 6 months before that decision had to be made. It was a defensive conversation from my perspective. I'm trying to protect the team that's actually got to do this integration. From the client's perspective, it was actually incredibly helpful because they were then able to actually put stipulations in their contracts that were in procurement at that time. You have to provide this data in this format to comply with this. And then it's like, yeah, cool. If they can do that, I can build the integration to be data source agnostic. I'll make a nice little UI in the Drupal backend where you just change the URL where the data comes from, and magic, right? It's never magic, but that's the idea. Thank you. Does that actually answer your question? Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. We appreciate you coming, and I fully respect the desire to get to the front of the lunch line. So as a friendly reminder, after lunch starts contribution sprints. I hope you can make it.
Yeah, thank you so much.